Hello students, welcome to lecture 1.4, European Discovery and Colonization of a New World. In this lecture I will talk about of European exploration and discovery of Africa and the Americas, then the role of Portugal and Spain, the voyages of Christopher Columbus, and then the role of the Africans in the slave trade, and finally the mistreatment of the slaves during the capture in Africa. First, let's address the question of why the Europeans ventured out of Europe and went to explore and colonize the rest of the world, starting from the 1400s. The Europeans started to explore the world in the 1400s because they wanted spices and gold. They also wanted to expand their knowledge of the world as well as spread Christianity. The acquisition of different tools such as stronger ships, devices such as astrolabe, quadrant, and the magnetic compass especially made the exploration of the world possible. We can see on this picture the replica of Santa Maria, the ship that was used by Christopher Columbus during his first trip to America. As we can see, this ship really looked like a very strong ship that can navigate the high seas. Portugal and Spain played very important roles during the first centuries of European exploration of the world. Portugal first was the first nation to venture outside Europe by colonizing the Atlantic islands such as the Canaries, Cape Verde, and the Azores. These are islands in the Atlantic Ocean that are now close to Portugal, and they did that starting from the mid 1400s. They also started to explore the coast of Africa and traded with the Africans along the coasts of Africa. But at the end of the 1400s, Spain joined and surpassed Portugal. So Spain came right after Portugal. As you may already know, Christopher Columbus was working for the Kingdom of Spain when he traveled west, and his attempt was to reach Asia. Especially he wanted to go to Japan or at least China or India. However, little did he know that there was a huge continent on his way. So as a result of his misunderstanding of the world, he landed by mistake on the island of Hispaniola, which is in America, and he believed that he got to India, and this is why he called the Native Americans Indians, and we still call the Native Americans Indians because of this mistake by Christopher Columbus. But the Native Americans died by thousands as they got in contact with Europeans. The reason for this is that the Native Americans were not immune to the new disease that were brought by the Europeans, and they were not also used to work hard, so they died because of the overwork imposed by the Europeans. So ultimately, since Europeans needed a lot of workers to produce cash crops such as sugar cane, cotton, and so on and so forth, and also since they need also workers to mine gold and silver, they turned to Africa as a source of workers. The Africans participated both in the Atlantic slave trade to America as well as in the Islamic slave trade to North Africa and the Middle East. So what were really the role of the Africans in this slave trade? Slavery existed in Africa as in other countries for thousands of years. So Africans conducted the Islamic slave trade through the Sahara deserts for thousands of years, even before they traded slave with the Europeans. They already traded slave with the Arabs through the Sahara desert. But they mainly traded women and children. So when the Europeans came to Africa to find workers, to find slaves, there was already a thriving market of slaves in Africa at that time. So they didn't really have a problem to find slaves to buy when they get there in the 14th and 1500s. So the Europeans just bought slaves from African traders. The slaves that were sold were war captives, which means people that were caught during the war between tribes and kingdoms. And these captives were enslaved and sold either to Europeans or to Arabs. So West Africans, especially those who are living in the forest, on the coastal area of Benin or Nigeria, these Africans were well known for their participation in the African slave trade. Christopher Columbus's voyage to America changed completely the slave trade in Africa. As we already said earlier, the Native Americans died by thousands and millions when they get in touch with the Europeans because of the disease as well as because of the work that was imposed by the Europeans. So the Europeans had to turn to Africa for workers or for slaves. So as a result, the number of slaves from Africa to America grew tremendously between 1500 and the 1800. At the beginning, Spain and Portugal dominated the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, but they were quickly surpassed by other European nations, such as Holland, France, and especially England between 1600 and 1700. This chart shows the number of slaves from Africa to America. So as you can see, the number of slaves from Africa grew from nearly zero in the early 1500s to 2 million every 25 years in 1776, 1800. So 2 million every 25 years, that's about 100,000 slaves a year. So how many slaves were brought from Africa to America between 1500 and 1800 when the trade stopped? No one really knows exactly how many, but there are some historians who estimate that the total number of Africans who were brought to America would be around 50 million. The Atlantic slave trade was also known as the Middle Passage, And the reason for that is that it was part of a triangular trade, and the Middle Passage constitute the second leg of that triangular trade. And we can see the triangular trade in the next figure. So on this figure we have the triangular trade, and it also explains how it worked. First you have the first leg of a triangle which started in Europe with ships loaded with textiles, arms, and other manufactured goods. So these goods were brought to Africa, where they were traded for slaves. And then the second leg of a triangular trade started in Africa and went to America with ships that were loaded with slaves. And these slaves were traded for cash crops once they get in America. So the cash crops that were traded with African slaves were mainly sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Finally, the third leg of a triangular trade starts from the Americas and went back to Europe. And this time we have ships loaded with the cash crops that we were saying earlier. So the ships that went to Europe brought sugar, cotton, and tobacco. Now let's talk about the mistreatment of the slaves during the capture in Africa. The ordeal of the African slave started even during their capture in Africa. So once they were captured during the wars in Africa, they were driven to the coast by slave traders in chains and yokes, and they may have to travel long distance. And once they were at the ports, they were held in dungeons, the so-called factories, before they were loaded on the slave ships. And most of the time they can be also branded like cattle in the process. And finally they were loaded on the ship. But this mistreatment done by slave traders and also the Europeans, this mistreatment or brutalization were meant to destroy their self-respect as well as their identity. So this figure shows us how the Africans were driven to the coast. As you can see, they were put in chains and yokes by the slave traders. So you can see also the slave traders by their sides who drove them to the coast. And you can see that some of them are children, many of them are men, and women even with children, small children. So that concludes this lecture, lecture 1.4. Please move to lecture 1.5 to continue the module.